the first casualties of the 3 cultural wars in our midst. War number 1 was secular statism that declared was a war on religion. It weakened our public institutions and it opened this door of corruption that we're seeing in our society today. And when your political figures are polling at 11 to 13%, these are the people that are writing our laws, you know that we have a challenge with a culture of corruption. But in this war on religion, our schools were scrubbed by all reference to God. In 1962, the Supreme Court struck down state-sponsored school prayer. In 1963, the court decided that you can't read the Bible or recite the Lord's Prayer in a public environment. In 1980, the courts ruled that the 10 Commandments had to be removed from our public schools. The second war that the progressives declared was a war on marriage. This weakened marriage and opened the door to the culture of meaninglessness. There was mentioned earlier the political fascination of Washington, D.C. and how we're divided now as a nation regarding some of the terminologies and even political parties in Washington, D.C. Because what the secular left did was they went into the power structures in our society. And as you were just told about the different governments that are available for mankind to self-govern, the federal government is totally out of control. And one of the reasons is because of the political environment. And much of these wars were started on that front. This war on marriage weakened women and opened this door of the new culture of meaninglessness, and so now homosexuality is dividing us and bringing hostility into the public square. Abortion has deeply hurt us. 55 million dead in 40 years should give all of us great pause. And yet, we still have debate and discussion and even denial about the influence of Roe v. Wade in the society and how this great crime against humanity still cannot be purged through, I guess you could call it, civil means. In 1960, 75% of American adults were married compared to just 50% today. In 1960, 45% of young adults between 18 and 24 were married compared to just 9% today. There is indeed a war against marriage. I'm going to repeat that one because it's very important. That in 1960, 45% of young adults between 18 and 24 were married and just 9% are married today. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was president, 18% of births were outside of marriage compared to 43% today. Blacks went from 22% in the 60s to 72% today. Whites went from 3% in the 60s to 30% today. Hispanics, there was no data in the 60s because they weren't a political group to be manipulated, but we sure know that data today. And it's 53% out of wedlock groups. In a Gallup poll done just earlier this year, 71% of respondents between 18 and 34, our youth, our children, 71% between 18 and 34 said having a baby outside of marriage is morally acceptable. The third war the enemies of God declared was a war on poverty, a weakened family, and opened the door for this culture of entitlements. The Great Society has had great cost. In just 50 years, blacks went from 70% of their children being raised in marital households to 70% being raised now in single households. In just 50 years, blacks went from a civil rights movement to remove governmental barriers over education so they could live free, according to our Constitution. When Martin Luther King Jr. went to Washington, D.C., it was a moral statement. He went to the Declaration of Independence and said, "You've gotten away from your founding and you've given us a check that's come back stamped insufficient funds. Remove these governmental barriers so we can live free according to the mandates of our God." And instead of removing that, we saw intervention of government, and now the current male dropout rate in most of our black neighborhoods is 70% in high school. In just 50 years, blacks went from landowners and entrepreneurs to today, less than 5% of blacks are even in their own business, and 23% of African Americans work directly for the government. The legacy of 50 years of black quest for social justice to the head of a big federal government is our blighted inner cities, our dysfunctional government schools, and broken black families. And the legacy of 50 years of the liberal assault on religion and traditional marriage is why unmarried American women today vote for big government. Unmarried women of all nationalities and ethnicities are becoming government dependent because they are sexually active and aging alone. Government dependency gripped America's poor and minority communities 50 years ago and locked 3 generations in economic stability. And today, government dependency is choking our entire nation. People want to say that there's no place to talk about these things in the church. Well, I'm glad for Wynn to give us opportunity, even though we are in a church, to come and talk about these serious matters. 70% of non-defense tax intake today is a transfer to individuals. Today, 47% of Americans are some way government dependent. It's God or government, as I said last night in my testimony. You can't have a world of both. When you looked at what the scripture says, Jesus said, render to Caesar what's his, but what belongs to me, that's mine. And what belongs to God is the hearts and minds of men so that they will desire to fulfill their destiny. We get this much space on this side of eternity. And we do not have time for an interruptive enemy to come in through secular statism and get in the way of people fulfilling that they need to do with their lives. I've been in too many housing projects across this country and too many of our hard-hit inner-city schools where people are crying out to get free from the grip of big government so that they can live free. I've had to confront too many of them that just think that this is all of their existence and it will be that way for the rest of their lives. And from womb to tomb, they have no other opportunity. Not on my watch, not in a free country. Not with God's providential hand on this land. Today, 48% of all births are paid for by Medicaid, and Medicaid pays for the bills of 65% of all long-term nursing home care. Now, I wouldn't mind, I suppose, if government actually was benevolent. It actually was an instrument to care about people. But we know that that's not true. We know, according to the scripture, that we have an obligation to speak truth into the hearts and minds of men, and that is not a role for government. And I don't have time this morning to get into all of the scriptures that point to freedom and personal responsibility and speak against a federal welfare state. Means-tested federal welfare programs are $800 billion. The entitlements alone, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, are $1.4 trillion. $80 trillion in unfunded liability because of a political promise that we will do what God told us not to do. That we will force a power, an invisible power at that, between individuals caring for their own in family and